Welcome to The Memory Game, a podcast where I, Nathan Tuffin,
and I, Rob Beer, exchange voice notes as we carry out the important work of recording an emotional history of video games.
For the betterment of future generations.
This week, Nath asked a question about the knowledge we've gained from games.
Hey, Pod Rob. So I awoke this morning, bleary-eyed and confused from another night of sleep disrupted by an unruly baby, and I staggered into my bathroom, and in the mirror I examined my rapidly aging face and realised it had been several weeks since I'd trimmed my beard, which was now jutting out at all sorts of unusual angles, and had become voluminous and untamed. And this isn't ideal, because when my beard gets too long, it starts to produce the occasional thick, wiry, ingrown hair, which can get infected and become quite painful. So I spotted one and I grabbed some tweezers to remove it, but instead of the satisfying twang of the hair being plucked from my beard, there was a loud rubbing sound, like someone drawing a spool of wire through a fence hole. And the hair I plucked from my face kept going and going and going, until eventually I had removed a record-breaking 4-foot-long beard hair from my person. I lay it on the bathroom floor to get a better look at it, and it formed into a sentence, written in a beautiful looping cursive script, which I then realised to my astonishment was a question about video games. The thoughts you expressed in your reply on last week's podcast felt really well thought through. They were very reflective and I think quite sensitively considered. And I appreciated you including them, especially as you mentioned that you were immediately filled with doubt about the validity of what you were saying. But to try and reassure you, I completely agreed with everything you put out there, and it resonated with me as well. And pondering those sort of various moral complexities involved in it all, that initially sent my thoughts out and away from video games. But as always, they eventually landed back in that region again, and that's how I came up with this week's question. So obviously your point about Red Dead Redemption 2 and the story I told about encountering a slaver, that left a lot of food for thought. And one of the main things you made me consider that I hadn't really thought about before is that idea of a video game inserting a modern perspective, contemporary sensibilities into historical issues. And then, weighing up the merits of that course of action, whether or not that's the right thing to do. And of course, video games themselves, they're a very young mode of entertainment in the grand scheme of things. And they are quite immediate, and they usually need to be more fun than they need to be accurate or educational. And they're a product, I suppose, at the end of the day, that companies usually want to sell to as many people as possible. So it is only natural that they would simplify historical perspectives and kind of imprint modern sensibilities onto historical events. But so that chain of thought kind of, it made me think about how we learn about history and world events from media, like games and films and books, and how really most of what I know about the history of the United States and its relationship to slavery and, that whole period of time from Red Dead Redemption 2, it all comes from those mediums. We're both history graduates, and I know there are probably periods of history that we're quite knowledgeable about. But through my entire education, including university, the focus was on British and European middle and late history, and America didn't enter into it into the slightest, or very rarely that I remember. And thinking about that, eventually, that sort of brought me back to thinking about what real life facts I've actually learned from video games, and the value, if any, they would have outside of that sphere. Clearly I'm not going to be passing any exams with the facts I've learned from video games, but at the very least it might help me preserve my know-it-all persona, which is something that's very important to me and I've been cultivating for some while. But that sort of, relatively heavy initial thoughts, it took me to a much more frivolous place. And I remembered a pub quiz I went to many years ago with my old school friends, where this question came up that no one else could answer. And it was, what was the ring name of the boxer Roberto Duran? And I knew the answer because in the Knockout Kings boxing series of video games, I think they're on the PlayStation, you could play as him. He's like this historic boxer. And in the ring announcement, Bruce Buffer would introduce him as Manos de Piedra, which means hands of stone. And everyone was impressed with my great knowledge, I'm sure. So that long, winding road leads me to ask, what information have you gleaned from video games that would give you the advantage in a pub quiz or, trivia night type situation? My first choice is something I learnt from the game Commando for the PS1. So I think I would have been playing that probably in the late 90s. And I actually learnt this from the instruction manual, which feels quite unusual for that time because how often as a kid do you ever actually read an instruction manual? But I think it was one of those instruction manuals, like a lot of the old PlayStation ones, that actually it had a bit of the sort of story of the game in it, and it had a big list of all the weapons you could pick up from these different portions of the game. And my memory of Time Commando is very blurry, so I'll leave it that way as I recount it here, and I'll try and fill in some of the gaps in the research notes. But from what I can recall, I think you played as some sort of time traveller from the future, and then something happens that means you have to work your way through various stages of history, from sort of cavemen era to the Second World War, and then in each setting, everything wants to fight you. So I think in that sort of first level where it's sort of cavemen, all the cavemen want to fight you. There's no chatting or working out what's going on. I think there's a saber-toothed tiger, which probably doesn't quite work in the actual history of things, but that fights you. Basically everything fights you. I don't remember there being puzzles or anything like that. You just walk through each level, you pick up a few different weapons, and you batter everyone that you encounter for like 7 eras of history. I remember there being so prehistoric times, definitely ancient Rome, because I think there was like a gladiator scene. Feudal Japan, maybe, where I'm pretty sure you fight a dragon. So also, how historically accurate is that? Medieval Europe, and then the World Wars. I'm pretty sure you could do World War 1 and 2 as well. And I was also terrible at it. I remember that much. So I think most of my memory of that game comes from watching my dad play through it. Anyway, the thing I learnt from that game, or from the instruction manual, that could potentially have been of use in a pub quiz or trivia night sort of setting, is they're in the weapons listing for the medieval Europe portion of the game. It's that one of those big pole arms with an axe head and a spike on top, and then that sort of smaller blade on the other side of the shaft, that's called a halberd, or halberd. But I must have been maybe 10 or 11 when I played that game, and that fact stuck with me for many years. I'm sure I would have learnt it from a big pile of other games since. There's loads of sort of medieval fighting games and stuff like that. But that definitely would have been the first place that I discovered it. My second choice is from the game Rome Total War, which I played through a huge heap during my first year of university. And at one point near the end of the year, my friend Jack came to visit me for a week or so. And instead of going out drinking or exploring campus life, we holed up in my room and played hours and hours of Rome late into the night. And I feel like I learned a decent chunk about Roman history from that game. I haven't remembered much of it. But my favourite thing, and one that feels like it could probably come up in a pub quiz, is that the military formation that Roman legionaries do, where they sort of all bunch up together and they create a kind of turtle shell to protect themselves from projectiles with their shields. That's called a testudo. And I remember it very distinctly because it feels like a word we just repeated over and over again for the duration of that week. Quick! They've got loads of archers coming! Testudo! Testudo! So that's the one I remember from that. My final example is a bit more recent. It's from the game Crusader Kings 2, where you take control of a leader in historical Europe, and you play as them and their heirs, and you try and create a dynasty and wield power over different chunks of Europe. And this is a really simple one, but it's the meaning of the term casus belli, which is a phrase that appears constantly in the Crusader Kings games, and it basically just means a case for war. And you have to have one, you have to have a case for war if you want to invade any other territory in the game, which I immediately found super annoying when I first started playing the game. In pretty much any other strategy game, like the Civilization or Total War series, if you want to war it up with someone, you just do it, you just invade and start fighting them. But all of a sudden, I'm playing this game, and it's like, sorry, mate, you need a casus belli, which was infuriating. Though, if you play that game for long enough, you do sort of discover subsequently that the whole purpose of the game really isn't about fighting. It's about finding and fabricating casus bellis and other sort of claims on territory, probably much more so than anything else. So that does eventually become the fun of the game. So that would be my third one. In retrospect, all of those examples come from games about history, and really they're just the names of stuff. But I'm satisfied they're all things that would have given me a leading edge in a pub quiz, or even perhaps in a game of Trivial Pursuit. Anyway, buddy, I'm excited to hear your answers, so hit me up.
Hey there, Testudo. Thanks for highlighting the fact that if we were in a pub quiz and there was a history round, people would be looking at us for our degrees, but ultimately we'd be drawing upon knowledge that we got from Age of Empires and Total War games. That's absolutely where my knowledge well comes from, and a bit of horrible histories. I'd love to have a well of knowledge taken from Rome Total War, but it's a game that I paid almost full price for in an era where I never bought games for more than a tenner. I loved Shogun Total War, and I was really desperate to play Rome Total War, and got a new PC, a rubbish new PC that my mum bought me for going to uni with. Should have been a laptop as well, if I've been thinking about it, then I could have taken it to the library. But it did not run that game. And no matter how much I tried to lower the graphic settings and all of that stuff, it just didn't have enough RAM to get off the ground. It might have even been one of those that will load the menu screen, but not the actual game, which is pure heartbreak, isn't it? You know, there's a sort of tier system of PC games not working. The first of which being just it won't install. It just recognises it's like, it's not worth trying, mate. And then beyond that is the ones that will install but never launch. You just get the instant crash. And then in that top tier is the ones that are just right on the edge of being playable, but not opening the actual game. And that was Rome Total War for me. The other category, of course, is the ones that do run, but in a way that's so limited as to make the game unplayable, which I experienced playing Rift with you. But I think I might have spoken about that in the pre-season, so I'll skip over that. And if not, we'll slam it in as a postscript. All of which is a distraction to getting around to answering your question. What I really liked about it wasn't a question about what computer games do we know most about, you know, what's our mastermind topic, and instead had this sort of pub quiz focus, which I think narrows it really nicely. And so what I tried to do was think about settings where it might give me the answers that other people wouldn't have. So one of the ones that, maybe this is oddly specific, but I definitely wouldn't know what the word scry meant if I hadn't played Slay the Spire or then subsequently Magic the Gathering, which has a computer game mode, but is obviously traditionally a real-life trading card game. And I think I could only learn to play that game because I'd played Slay the Spire. And Scry is specifically a mechanic that lets you look at the cards that are coming up and then lets you place them at the bottom of the deck. And that word has its origins in scrying, is foretelling the future. So if there was some sort of pub quiz round that had obscure words or meanings of words, I feel like I might have been best placed to answer that. And I would just, if I gave that answer, I'd try and look nonchalant as though it was the grounding of my education that gave me that, but secretly it's just computer games. Another one another round that I thought I might have a good shout in is if there was some sort of sports round that was built around American football. Obviously, we've spoken about this in the past, and we both watch a chunk of American football. We play a lot of fantasy football. But I think, having watched it with people, I think you can watch it for a good decade and still only have a surface level understanding of a lot of the core elements of the game. And the commentators, because they're American and big and brash and excited by life, they don't stop to try and explain any of the fundamentals of what they're talking about. They sort of assume a level of knowledge in the audience that doesn't exist. So you talk about hitch routes, they talk, slants, and list off all these positions at a pace that you just can't at all comprehend. But I've been able to understand that language because of my time spent playing Madden. Again, this was brought home to me when I was watching with a friend. I said, "Oh, he's got an audible to the run there." Some comment like that, and they looked at me like, "What's an audible?" And I was like, "We've been watching this sport together for like 5 years." But I think it's just, it's a game where you could be watching it for the rest of your life and still be learning about things each time you watch it. That's part of the allure of it, I think, is that it feels like something that's been beamed from space on a laser beam rather than something that's emerged from the human mind. So yeah, either a picture round showing all the different route patterns and naming and labelling those. I think I could do that in a way that most people wouldn't. Or just naming positions. A lot of my American geography is based on American sports teams as well, so that's might see me well in a geography round. to your point, that was something that it's not really about American football. That's about what I garnered from playing the game of American football. And it's because thinking about the positions and stuff there, that comes from doing the sort of roster management stuff in the game. Whereas if you're watching highlight reels, it wouldn't really matter who the right linebacker is or the left end. These are things that you've got to be deep in the trenches of watching to care about these things. Or American, and then you just learn it in kindergarten or something. A link to that is also, I couldn't pick between these two, but either Tony Hawk's or SmackDown, which are both things where I haven't watched much wrestling at all. And the last time I was on a skateboard when I was like 12 and I broke my arm going down a hill, and I've kept myself fully clear of that since. But I can watch, Olympic skateboarding and tell you the names of the tricks because of Tony Hawk's 2 and my time spent playing that. In fact, with Tony Hawk's 2, that's a game that I mastered playing whilst recovering from my broken arm, which is an irony itself, isn't it? Might have been the thing that caused my arm break and cured me of it because it kept me still so that I could recover from it. And wrestling would be the same. So I think I've probably watched in total 10 hours of WWE, but I can name you 100 wrestlers and a bunch of their special moves because of my time spent playing SmackDown. So I suppose a counter question that I could give to you there is, what's the thing that you spent a lot of time playing a computer game version of that you have a sort of passing interest in outside of that? Maybe something like UFC might fit in there. I know you've probably got that sort of mismatch, but is there anything else that I don't know about? Any secret hobbies that you're thinking about? And don't you dare say you're interested in stealing vehicles in some sort of grand theft format, because I know you have no interest in that in reality. I've just remembered as well that when I bought the PC, and possibly when I bought Rome Total War, I also bought Tony Hawk's 2 remastered for about a tenner for the PC, and then I tried to install it when I got to uni, maybe about 3 weeks in, and it made my machine crash. My motherboard melted or something, and I didn't have a PC in the first year for about 5 months because it took me ages to go and then get it sorted because I didn't want to spend money on it to get it sorted. I spoke about it at the time as the Tony Hawk's virus that broke my computer. But what a mess. Tony Hawk's, man, he's to blame for a lot.
Hey, hit route. I didn't really consider that question revealed the lack of our formal education, even without mentioning that we obtained our history degrees from the venerable University of Portsmouth. But it is definitely the case that very little we studied for would probably come up in most trivia contest pub quiz type situations. And that reminded me of one Christmas I spent with Hannah's family where we were playing Trivial Pursuit, and Hannah's mum accused me of cheating because I have a history degree when I correctly answered a question about Russian history, which one, wouldn't be cheating because it's just using the knowledge in your head to answer a question, which is the case for all quiz answers ever, and two, wasn't actually the case because I had actually learnt the information from the late 90s animated musical Anastasia. The story about your horribly broken PC and being so excited to play Rome Total War but it just not working, that brought back so many memories from my childhood and teenage years of getting games and then just a complete failure to get going, and then no one in my life at the time, including myself, having any clue on how to fix it. And it definitely feels like there must be an episode focusing on times where we were crushingly disappointed by the limitations of hardware. That's got to be somewhere on the horizon. My parents similarly bought me a PC to go to university with, and it was such a lovely gesture. It must have cost them a load of money, which I did hugely appreciate at the time, but they wanted it to be a big surprise, so they just went into PC World and got one that the guy there said would be good at games. Of course, it wasn't really that good at games. It couldn't run a lot of the stuff I wanted it to, and it horribly died shortly after I left uni. That could have also been because of, overuse, constantly being on and in use the entire time I was away. And not only that, but I spoilt the surprise of them getting it for me by telling them, like 10 minutes before they revealed it to me, about how for my next PC, I want my friend Justin to design and build it because that'll be better than the shop-bought one. And then, they had to go, oh, well, surprise, here's a new computer. But Justin has built and designed every machine I've owned since then, so... And they've been some absolute beasts. There's been very few games, well, no games actually, they couldn't play, and they've all been very, very robust and lasted for years. So it came good in the end. So excellent answers, buddy, which included the depth I was hoping for after my just knowing the names of stuff examples. And of course, the one I related to most was American football, having played Madden a lot, often with you over the past few years. I definitely wouldn't have started watching the NFL if I hadn't played Madden before so much. And I think I probably would have just found American football, the game rules, impenetrable and not being able to garner what was actually going on, what the goal of each play is. And I think for me, there's something about learning things through video games, like, learning through experimentation and trial and error. And that far surpasses the ability to learn things from watching, as would have been the case if I just decided one day to start watching the NFL without any prior knowledge or experience. Save for the excellent TV show Friday Night Lights, which I highly recommend. So having said all that, I do think that you picked up a higher tier level of American football knowledge from Madden than most of us do, or especially most non-Americans anyway. So I can choose like routes and running lanes, and I know the different kind of play you're supposed to make on third down, say. But you learned you can read defenses and offenses, you can change things up on the fly, and just generally have this kind of extra ability when it comes to knowing the sport, and it feels a bit like those people who play Flight Simulator for years and then eventually they get in a real plane and they can actually fly it. I think that might be not a real, that could be an urban legend, but I feel like I've read about that before. But with your height and natural athletic ability, it wouldn't be a huge surprise if you called me up one day with the news that you'd been named starting quarterback for your local gridiron team. They'd probably be called the Wildcats or the Wolverines or something like that, and it would be based entirely on lessons you'd garnered from Madden. That just feels like something that could really happen. On your counter question about games I've enjoyed playing where I had very little interest in the thing outside of the game, I thought of a few that fit the bill, and Tony Hawk's and WWE games for you, that they're really good examples, because if someone asked me, does Rob know much about skateboarding and wrestling, I'd definitely say, yeah, he knows a good bit, certainly more than the layman, but it turns out, based on conversations that we've had before, but it turns out that all comes from video games, so that's quite impressive, really. So the main one I thought of was House Flipper, which I've played in my relentless pursuit to find a game that relaxes me. And in that you sort of wallpaper, you design a house and you do wallpapering, you lay floors, you paint things, you clean up, you strip paint from different bits, you put in sinks and fit radiators and all those kind of things. That's all something I have very little interest in, and I know very little about, but I played that game a lot, and I found it really fun. I also feel like it did give me a sort of simplified knowledge of how you might fit a kitchen. Not that feels definitely that's not something that you want to undertake just based on a video game. But yeah, so that felt like a good example. And UFC was also a really good shout that you mentioned. I've played 3 or 4 of the UFC video games, maybe other mixed martial arts fighting games as well. I really enjoyed all of them, but I don't think I've ever watched an actual match. Not that I can remember, not certainly for a very long time. And I don't really know much about the sport beyond what I've gleaned from the Conor McGregor documentary on Netflix, which was very good. And of course, I know very little about moving to a new city as a beleaguered migrant from a war-torn Baltic state, and then getting embroiled in the underworld and embarking on a life of crime to better my fortunes and help my struggling cousin. But I have learned all about that from a video game, the title probably best left unsaid. Okay, on to a research note. All of these are about Time Commando, which I watched a long play of. I couldn't stop watching it because it's absolutely crackers. And I noticed that visually, it looked quite a lot like the racing game Planet of Death, Pod, which you mentioned as an answer in the episode on cars in video games at the end of season 1. Everyone is rendered in that sort of early CGI from the mid-90s. They look a bit sort of sausagey and awkward, like, I don't know if you remembered or watched it, the kids' TV show Reboot. Everyone looks a bit like that. So I'll put a link to the long play in the show notes, but from what I can tell, you play a guy called Stanley. He works for a big military-type corporation that's developed technology to simulate the past to recreate combat from all periods of history. I don't know, it's set in the future, and you do see where he's from in the end, and it's like laser guns and stuff. It's that far in the future. Why they would need or find any value in the prehistoric fighting with sticks and spears, I don't know. But, maybe there's like a feral sort of unhinged element to that would be valuable for some reason. Anyway, Stanley's having a regular day at work when a virus, maybe the Tony Hawk's virus, created by a rival company, that infects some of the timelines he works with. It makes everything go wrong, and then somehow threatens to create a vortex which will swallow the entire world. So Stanley has to go in to the simulation and stop the virus just by beating things up in all of the different timelines, which I listed before, but I got them quite wrong, or wrong in a few places. So there's the prehistoric era, the Roman Empire, feudal Japan, medieval Europe, conquistadors was definitely one I missed, where, spoilers, Stanley beats up some invading conquistadors on one of their ships, and then he goes onto the land and he batters some of the indigenous tribes people that they've come to conquer. So no one is safe from old Stanley. Then he goes to the Wild West, and then modern wars. So there's World War One. For some reason, it skips World War II and then goes into the future, and he fights in World War III. And then there's this further future era where Stanley is actually from, and I think that's how the game ends. So that's it for the research notes. Finally, you sadly didn't get to learn Roman history from Rome Total War, but you said you played Shogun Total War, which I think is the very first in that series. So what did you learn about feudal Japan from that experience? I'd love to hear about that in the postscript, including if you saw Stanley from Time Commando anywhere, maybe beating up a dragon or something like that. Okay, thanks old chum. Much love, hugs, etc. A blue 25, hut, hut, hut.
One thing I've been thinking about as you gave your answers and I responded with mine was that the focus of this question was about the knowledge that we've got from computer games, i.e. sort of tangible things that we could use in pub quizzes. But really, most of what I've learnt from computer games is wisdom in some way, the lessons that you can take from games rather than individual bits of knowledge. And that's linked, I suppose, in some way to the question you were asking at the end there about what did I learn from Shogun? I'm still not good with my Japanese feudal states or even the sort of roles and hierarchy within that. But Shogun Total War, but the tactics of Shogun War taught me a lot about sort of diplomacy and the machinations of politics, I suppose. It also then made me remember a TV series that was called Time Commanders, which is weird because we spent loads of time talking about Time Commando, which is the first-person beat-em-up style game that you've eloquently described. But Time Commanders was apparently ran from 2003 to 2005, and it was basically like one of your favourite things, and it was like had that work-away day type thing where teams of people had to work together to take control over famous historic battles in the past. And they seemed to be playing basically like a quite good version of Total War. So it was different battles through history, but they were in charge of commanding their troops. And rather than sitting down there and playing on PC, I think one of the producers had the control to actually like instruct the computer game. And the team was sort of split up across. I don't know if one of them had total command and then they had to sort of subdivide. So others had like different views of the screens. Maybe they were sort of sub-captains or whatever, and they had to shout at each other in a team building exercise type way. And there's so many things in there about the sort of dynamics of working relationships, and maybe it was not just work teams, but it just instantly took on that vibe of resentment and incompetence and unearned confidence that define those sorts of experiences. And one of the things that I was thinking about with that is in terms of like the wisdom that you garner from games is that something that absolutely everybody fell for all of the time was like, we've got to get the high ground. We must get the high ground. And that's obviously garnered from year 8 history. The Battle of Hastings, that seemed to play an important part in the Battle of Hastings was having the higher ground. And so that's just something that's it seemed every episode, like no matter the topography of the map or who the armies are, what the scenario was, it was like, we must take the high ground. Margaret, why aren't you taking the high ground? Like that kind of thing. And that's something that Shogun Total War taught me, is that there's probably more to battles than just getting on top of a hill. Although if you took me to an empty field and put me on a horse and told me to set up my army somewhere, you just know that I'd be heading for the crest of a hill. Stick that in a pub quiz.
Memory complete. Uploading memory.
Thanks for listening to The Memory Game. If you would like to share a gaming memory with us, ask us a question or send us your thoughts, you can contact us at memorygamepod@gmail.com or on Instagram @memorygamepod.